Hey, welcome to JRN 3365, where today we're going to be talking about lights, lighting, a bunch of different types of lighting techniques that kind of go into putting together things in the studio or when you're out gathering electric news, because we can't see anything without lights, and cameras definitely can't see things in the dark, and they're not as good as humans, so you got to kind of help them out a little bit. So when we're dealing with lights, we're basically dealing what people in cameras and devices can see. And so for cameras, they're kind of dealing with three shades of red, green, and blue, whereas with the human eye, we're kind of dealing with a little bit more than that. So the basic way that light works, or how you wind up seeing light, is in regular white light, there's going to be an entire spectrum of colors that your brain will interpret to be almost a white light. And so if things bounce off a reflective surface that's white, you're seeing every color in that spectrum coming into your eye. Now, if things are bouncing off a black surface, or in this case, they're actually being absorbed, since you're seeing that absence of light, you're now seeing things as a black color or a dark color. Now, for something that's a specific color, like in the case of this bottom one where you have this red banner, when light hits it, every light is absorbed except for the color that you see. So when we look at this apple in the middle of the screen, we can see that red, green, and blue, all the colors are hitting the apple, but only the red color is bouncing off and going into your eye. And so in the back of your eyeball are these little sensors called cones and rods. And the cones and rods allow you to interpret light, dark, shadows, and then as well as also images and colors. So they're going to help you see an image. So likewise, in the bottom corner where we have things like the banana, just like with the apple, everything is now being absorbed by the banana except for the color yellow. That's what's going into your eye, and that's what you're winding up seeing. Now, the human eye can see quite a range of visible colors or color wavelengths, things from purples into blues and yellows and reds. And then once they start moving out, we get into things like infrared or ultraviolet, which are just beyond the capability for the human eyes to see. So there are some things that cameras can see that we cannot, but for the most part, this is how a basic image goes from its source to your brain. Or in the case of a camera, it winds up getting seen instead of on the cones and rods. It's seen on this little chip called a CCD, a charged coupled device. And that CCD has the ability to record a channel of blue, a channel of green, and a channel of red. And it saves those channels as different parts of a video file, and then when it recreates it, it can go back and combine those channels together to give you the image that it originally saw. But likewise with the human eye, the camera has the ability to only see light that's reflected back to it from a surface. So in the case of a red apple, then the only light that's coming towards the camera's chip is going to be red. So it's going to wind up getting the ability to record the red. It's not going to record the other colors because they wound up being captured or not reflected by the item. So one of the things that a camera and humans have the ability to differentiate is between light and dark, and this is called the contrast ratio. And so with this, the human eye actually has two different ratios going on at one time. The first ratio we're talking about is what's known as a static ratio. This is kind of like the center of your eye when the center of your eye is looking at one specific point at a fraction of a moment. And that contrast ratio is only 1 of 100. And so this is basically just processing a single point. Now, when you look around, your eye's constantly moving everywhere. It's not just staring at one part of a letter. It's moving at words. It's looking at a whole image. And so your brain is taking all these single instances of contrast ratio to build an image. Now, in addition to that, you've got your peripheral vision that's happening around the side of your the focal point of your eye. And this is called your dynamic ratio. And the dynamic ratio is 1,000,000 to 1. And these combined together is your entire field of view. So this is one of the reasons with the contrast ratio, the static ratio, you can find something in the center of your vision and it's extreme clarity, but everything that's happening on your peripheral vision is a little more blurred because that dynamic ratio is kind of coming in, and so processing over time. Now, this gives us the ability for a person can look out a window and see the detail that's happening outside of the window and also see what's happening inside the window at the same time, even though the outside is 10,000 times brighter, especially on a sunny day. And this is a downside to cameras because cameras can only work with a static ratio of about 1,000 to 2,500 to 1, which is about the narrow field of our static vision. Cameras don't have the ability to pull out the dynamic ratio. So because of this, cameras have that hard trouble trying to see things outside and inside at the same time. And this is the reason why we tell you not to shoot in front of a window. So with this dynamic ratio, as you see it with your eye, you're able to see everything inside the window that's happening under a specific type of lighting. Everything outside, different lighting, but your brain can handle both of those. For a camera, or with static ratio, it's either going to be one or the other. It can't be both. So when I look at this, to make everything inside the darker area that's inside the window visible, I've got to open that iris and let more light in. And when that happens, your background window gets overexposed and you can't see what's happening. But if we take that iris and we close it down to let things on the inside be seen, well, the problem is now that the outside is visible, but we brought down the inside light so much that you can't see what's happening on the inside. So this is the static ratio, is that it can only do one type of lighting, either indoor or outdoor. It can't do both like the human eye can see. So here's a video of a guy trying to adjust his light for either indoor or outdoor. But if you can see, the camera is having an issue shooting both good quality video outside the room, good quality video inside the room. It's either going to give you one or the other, so you're going to have a hard time setting that up. The best way to solve this situation would, well, easy to be to move him away from the window, or if you have blinds on the window that you can close, or if there's screens that you can kind of do to lower the brightness outside, it would kind of filter it. So one of the things that I want to look at is this is a news story that a reporter went out to do a story on a local restaurant. And when they shot the video, they had a lot of problem with contrast ratio. So let's take a listen at the story.
Alabama. Just off U.S. Highway 231 in Troy. If you follow the smoke from its chimney, you'll find Hook's Barbecue. This local favorite has found its way into the Alabama Tourism Department's book, Alabama Barbecue, Delicious Road Trips. And its loyal customers know why.
I got some North Alabama roots, and I've always enjoyed barbecue North Alabama, and this reminds me of that barbecue as well.
I like the sauce on it. It's just a great tender meat, and I love it.
On a typical day, folks line up to chow down with barbecue done the old-fashioned way.
Primitive caveman cooked with fire. Now we're a little more advanced than that, but it still is. I mean, it's meat cooked over an open flame.
The folks at Hook's slow cook their meat on this huge brick pit, and the smell of barbecue and that slow cooked goodness can't be missed.
A lot of barbecue places may use hickory, mesquite, but we use oak exclusively. We think that's the best flavor, the best smoke.
And whether it's the pork being sliced and diced, that tender chicken, or the ribs cooked just right, you can't go wrong.
It is an art. I mean, it's like a musician's instrument. You get the fire and canvas of a painter. I mean, that's what we work with.
You know, the great thing about barbecue is you don't always have to eat it inside the restaurant. I like to get it to go sometimes. So I thought I'd take a trip here to my family's farm in Pike County and dig into what I'm told you have to have if you have nothing else at Hook's, and that's the ribs. Slow cooked over that oak wood fire for hours and hours. Tender and juicy, I'm told. Let's give it a shot. Just enough of that smoke to get into the meat, but not to overpower it. Just enough salt, just enough seasoning, just enough vinegar to really give it a unique taste. And it is tender too, but not too tender, but just enough that when you bite into it, It comes right off the bone. So the next time your taste buds are telling you, hey, go get me some barbecue, make a trip down to Hook's Barbecue in Troy. Try anything on the menu from the pork to the chicken to all the fixins, but of course, get an order of these ribs. See what makes them a taste of the South. That's positively.
Okay, that looked really good. I'm not gonna lie. Now, going back and looking at some of that, let me scrub through. So we noticed, like during this interview, you can see that the window of her behind the customer is extremely overexposed. And from what I saw earlier in the story, there should be like a blue sky or something out there. Let's look at another part. Same way with this interview. Again, right in front of the window, so that's overexposing everything and making it hard to see. In the case of this graphic, again, the windows are overexposed, and so they're trying to get all that. So when we got an interview with, not the meat, let's go back and find this gentleman. Again, so it's a little bit easier to see him because you don't have that bright source coming behind him. And likewise, when they had the video of the meat, the guy cooking as well, the video looks a lot better again because you're not having to deal with the contrast ratio. Now, we're running into something interesting here in this shot, that when he drives up, you can see that he is relatively dark and the background looks pretty good because the clouds are coming overhead and they've kind of dimmed everything out. And so this actually makes for good light. He looks pretty good. Everything else looks pretty good as well. And so let's go a little bit further in the timeline. And so we've run into this problem here. You can see that the sun has come out. Now, what's kind of happening is he's actually under the shade of a tree. So his light is different than the light back where the pond is. So as the sun came out, the camera had a hard time adjusting between his darker colors and the lighter color of the pond. And so the way the camera was set up, it wound up trying to keep him as the focus, so it wound up overexposing everything else in the video. So that's one of the reasons why you have to be careful when you're shooting, especially outside when you're coming into light and dark, if you're having over cloudy or if you're having clouds that are coming and going. This also plays in when you have things like outdoor events where there are tents involved. So in the case of this video that was shot, we have a groundbreaking for a new building that's coming in. And they do have people sitting under a tent for comfort, and you kind of see that the person standing here is out in the sun. So we're running into an issue as well, that if we want to see a good shot of the people under the tent, under that dark area, the outside is going to wind up getting overexposed. Now, sometimes you can find a good balance. It may be if it's overcast, that will kind of help you out a lot. And this was done to a pretty good shot. I can kind of see that it's not a great blue outside, so it looks like the clouds are coming out. So that's kind of helping lower the contrast ratio so your camera can be done inside. When I look at this image on the left, I can see that the video in the windows is starting to get a little bit overexposed. So for that, the contrast ratio is becoming an issue. And this is one of the reasons why we tell you guys not to shoot in front of windows. So anytime you do that, you're going to wind up getting video like this, where it's going to be either too hard to see outside or too hard to see the person inside. Although, when would be a good example to use that extreme contrast ratio for your camera? You can from time to time actually use it to your benefit. And so something that would help you is if you have a person who doesn't want their face to be seen. If you have an interview where a person talks about, well, I can only do it in under anonymity, then you can say, all right, we can set up a shot for you. And in this case, they put him in front of a window, and they wound up putting, he has a little bit further away from the window, so he's not getting light on his face or on his shoulders. And you can see that he's in a very dark area. So by doing this and adjusting the contrast ratio for the camera, they were able to hide this person's identity, which is a really good way to pull it off. One of the other things that people have been able to do is, in post-production, they will wind up blurring that person's face. So in this case, there was a woman and her manager who were talking about something that they wanted to do it and keep their identity hidden. But one of the things they forgot was during the manager's interview, she's over here without her face hidden, so that wound up spoiling or ruining the identity of the people involved. So that was a problem for the editor and the reporter. But that is one thing to be you can use, as you can blur people's face. But remember to make sure you get everything. Now, another thing that we're going to talk about is how different sources have different intensities and different colors, and these are called color temperatures. And so with the color temperature, this is basically one of the main sources of light we have is the sunlight. But the sunlight changes. So we've got two types of color temperatures, and I'll talk about that a little more in a moment. The first one is called bright sunlight, which the temperature is 5,600 degrees Kelvin. And this is more intense than an overcast light, which when it's overcast, the clouds are out. This is going to be more like your 6,500. Because that light is kind of getting dispersed out a little bit. Now, with bright sunlight, it can create either a hard directional shadow, or with a overcast, it can create a softer shadow. Sunlight is also not a good background. So this is one of the big things of why we tell you don't shoot in a indoors with that as the background. Because with sunlight, everything's going to change. Now, a moment ago, I talked about temperatures and a guy named Kelvin, and Kelvin is this guy. And who he is he was a British physicist, and he was conducting an experiment where he was heating a block of black coal. And he noticed that after a while, it went from black, and he started seeing a little bit red. And as it got hotter, it went from red to yellow. And then it went from yellow to blue, and then blue to white. And then as it cooled down, it went back in reverse. So it went back to from white to blue. It got colder and went to yellow, got colder and went to red. And so he played with the temperature, and he could go like red to yellow and back, or take it up to blue and come back. And so he realized that as the coal was reaching a specific a specific temperature, it was correlating to a color that the coal was glowing. And so with this, he created a scale of temperature known as the Kelvin scale. And with the Kelvin scale, he theorized, and I think he came out with that there are degrees of extreme heat and degrees of extreme cold. And there is a degree of extreme cold called absolute zero. This is where something cannot get any colder. And if you translate that into centigrade, that's negative 273 degrees centigrade. On the upper end of the scale, 100 degrees centigrade, 0 degrees centigrade is when water freezes. 100 degrees centigrade is when water boils. So we got 100, we got 0 when water freezes, negative 273 when it turns to when it can't get any colder at absolute zero. But beyond that, he wasn't able to come up with a absolute high end for heat. He just knows that there were things like 56K, 32K, and like. And so with that, he was able to take this temperature scale and adjust it into colors. So this is why we have color temperatures in light. And if you're ever looking at to get a new light bulb in the store, you're going to see things like daylight, warm light, soft light, and that's because they have different color temperatures. So for this first one, when we're talking about temperatures, we're going to be dealing with two major numbers in the realm of television lighting. The first one is called 32K, or 3,200. This is sort of a yellowish color. This is the color of most office lamps that you're going to see. A lot of traditional light bulbs are going to have this yellowish color, so do some headlights. Higher up on the spectrum, as we get into what's called cooler temperatures, so we're getting into bluish, is going to be 56K. And 56K is going to be things like direct sunlight. And if we go just a hair brighter, we're going to get into overcast, which is 65K. But when we're dealing with television lighting, 32K, 3200, or 5600 are going to be the two main numbers that we're going to wind up working with. So that's just a quick look about how we see and interpret lighting, and how light and lighting plays a major role when you are setting up for an interview or a studio production.